Ex-wife accuses millionaire of a 689 lotus fraud until the maid's 7-year-old daughter exposes the conspiracy in court, leaving everyone shocked. But what did she reveal that no one expected? Before we tell this tale, hit like and comment where you're watching from, and one word that describes you. The mahogany doors of Manhattan's Superior Court burst open with a thunderous crash as federal marshals escorted Robert Henderson through the packed corridor. The 62-year-old tech mogul, worth over $800 million just 3 months ago, now shuffled in orange prison garb and steel handcuffs that bit into his wrists. His salt and pepper hair, once meticulously styled for boardroom meetings, hung disheveled around a face that had aged decades in mere weeks. Deep lines etched around his eyes told the story of countless sleepless nights spent wondering how his entire world had crumbled so completely. The courtroom erupted in chaos as photographers' cameras flashed like lightning, capturing every humiliating moment of America's most spectacular financial downfall. Reporters shouted questions that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. "Mr. Henderson, did you really steal $600 million? How do you sleep at night knowing you destroyed thousands of families? Is it true you're hiding money in Swiss accounts?" In the front row, Victoria Henderson sat with perfect posture, her manicured hands folded elegantly in her lap. At 48, she was still strikingly beautiful, her platinum blonde hair swept into a sophisticated chignon that framed her angular face. Her navy Chanel suit whispered expensive taste and wounded dignity. She watched her ex-husband's humiliation with eyes that sparkled, with something that looked suspiciously like satisfaction, though she'd learned long ago to mask her true emotions behind a facade of grieving disappointment. "Order in the court!" Judge Patricia Williams commanded, her gavel striking the bench with sharp authority. At 57, Judge Williams had presided over some of Manhattan's most high-profile cases, but nothing quite like this. The gallery was packed with victims, elderly retirees who'd lost their life savings, middle-class families whose children's college funds had vanished overnight, and small business owners whose companies had collapsed when Henderson Tech's stock became worthless paper. "Mr. Robert James Henderson," Judge Williams called out, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "you stand accused of embezzling $689 million from Henderson Tech Industries, laundering money through offshore accounts in 7 countries, defrauding over 12,000 investors, and filing false financial statements with the Securities and Exchange Commission. These charges carry a maximum penalty of 150 years in federal prison. How do you plead?" Robert's weathered hands trembled as he gripped the defendant's table, his knuckles white with tension. The weight of everyone's stares pressed down on him like a physical force. In the gallery, he could see the faces of people he'd known for decades, business partners who'd shared holidays with his family, investors who'd trusted him with their grandchildren's futures, employees who'd believed in his vision of technological innovation changing the world. Now they all looked at him with hatred so pure it took his breath away. "Not guilty, Your Honor," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "I swear on my daughter's life, on my mother's grave, on everything I hold sacred, I am innocent of these charges. I have never stolen a penny from anyone." Victoria's lips curved into the faintest smile, so subtle that only someone who'd been married to her for 23 years would notice. She turned to her high-powered attorney, Marcus Goldstein, and whispered something that made him nod approvingly. Goldstein was Manhattan's most feared divorce lawyer, a man who'd built his reputation destroying wealthy men and leaving them with nothing but legal bills and bitter memories. But in the third row, barely visible among the crowd of angry adults, 7-year-old Isabella Martinez sat quietly beside her mother Maria, who worked the night shift cleaning offices in the Henderson Tech building. Isabella was small for her age, with enormous brown eyes that seemed to absorb everything around her with unusual intensity. Her long dark hair was braided with colorful ribbons, and she clutched a small pink backpack decorated with unicorns, a backpack that contained a secret powerful enough to destroy Victoria Henderson's perfect conspiracy and save an innocent man's life. As Judge Williams adjourned court for the day, Isabella tugged urgently on her mother's sleeve and whispered in rapid Spanish, "Mummy, I need to tell someone what I heard that night. Mr. Henderson didn't take the money. I know who really did it." 3 weeks earlier, Robert Henderson had been living what appeared to be the American dream in his sprawling Fifth Avenue penthouse. The 30-floor apartment boasted floor-to-ceiling windows, offering breathtaking views of Central Park, Italian marble floors that gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and walls lined with original Picassos and Monets. He'd built Henderson Tech from a garage startup into a global empire, creating revolutionary software that had changed how the world communicated. His personal fortune had grown to nearly $1 billion, making him one of America's youngest self-made billionaires. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Robert was in his home office, reviewing quarterly reports that showed record profits across all divisions, when his longtime assistant Jennifer knocked on the mahogany door with unusual urgency. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice tight with concern, "there are FBI agents here to see you. They say it's extremely important." Robert felt his blood turn to ice. He'd built his empire legally, paying every tax, following every regulation, treating employees fairly and investors honestly. What could the FBI possibly want with him? When he entered the living room, 3 agents in dark suits stood waiting, their expressions grave and professional. "Mr. Henderson, I'm Special Agent Sarah Martinez with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division," the lead agent announced, producing a thick folder of documents. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and securities violations involving approximately $689 million. The next few hours became a nightmare blur of handcuffs, Miranda rights and perp walks past cameras that broadcast his humiliation to the entire world. Within minutes, news vans surrounded his building, reporters screaming questions about offshore accounts he'd never heard of, shell companies he'd never created, and financial transactions he'd never authorized. The evidence against him was overwhelming and appeared airtight. Bank records showed massive transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Panama, all registered under his social security number and personal information. His digital signature was on hundreds of documents authorizing the movement of hundreds of millions. His personal computer, seized during the raid, contained encrypted files detailing the entire embezzlement scheme, complete with passwords and account numbers. Even his closest business partners, men he'd known since college, immediately distanced themselves from the scandal. Thomas Wright, his best friend and chief operating officer, called a press conference that same afternoon. Standing outside Henderson Tech headquarters, Wright looked directly into the cameras and said, "The board of directors has voted unanimously to remove Robert Henderson from all positions within the company. We are shocked and appalled by these revelations, and we want our investors to know that we had no knowledge of Mr. Henderson's criminal activities." The betrayal cut deeper than the legal charges. These weren't just business associates, they were the men who'd been groomsmen at his wedding, who'd celebrated the birth of his daughter, who'd supported him through his divorce. Now they were throwing him to the wolves to save their own reputations and careers. Victoria, meanwhile, had immediately called her own press conference. Standing outside their former matrimonial home in the Hamptons, a sprawling ocean-front estate she'd kept in the divorce settlement, she faced the cameras with tears streaming down her perfectly made-up cheeks. "I always suspected something wasn't right," she told reporters, her voice breaking with what sounded like genuine pain. "Robert became increasingly secretive and paranoid during our final years of marriage. He would disappear for hours, claiming he was working late. But now I realize he was probably orchestrating this terrible fraud. I feel so betrayed, not just as his ex-wife, but as someone who trusted him with our daughter's future." More, the performance was masterful, painting her as another victim of Robert's greed, while simultaneously establishing her credibility as someone who'd witnessed his suspicious behavior firsthand. Every major news network played her emotional statement, and public opinion immediately swung in her favor, the wronged woman whose ex-husband had stolen from innocent families. But hidden in the crowd of reporters and curiosity seekers, 7-year-old Isabella Martinez watched Mrs. Henderson's performance with confused recognition, remembering a very different conversation she'd overheard just months before. Isabella Martinez had been practically invisible in the gleaming corridors of Henderson Tech for over 2 years. At 7 years old, she was unusually small for her age, with long dark hair that her mother braided carefully each evening before their cleaning shifts began. While Maria worked methodically through executive offices with industrial vacuum cleaners and disinfectant, Isabella would complete homework assignments in empty conference rooms or color quietly in reception areas, her presence so unobtrusive that the building's powerful occupants barely registered her existence. But Isabella possessed something that made her incredibly dangerous to anyone with secrets, an extraordinary ability to observe and remember. Her young mind operated like a recording device, capturing conversations, facial expressions, and behavioral patterns that adults assumed no one would notice. She'd learned both English and Spanish from her mother, switching effortlessly between languages depending on who was around, and her naturally quiet demeanor meant people often forgot she was there entirely. Isabella had always been fascinated by Mr. Henderson. Unlike other executives who ignored her completely or treated her mother with barely concealed condescension, he always smiled warmly when he saw her. Sometimes he'd stop to ask about school in his careful Spanish, and twice he'd brought her chocolate bars from his business trips to Europe. She'd observed him working late into the night, seen him donate anonymously to the building's Christmas charity fund, and watched him patiently explain complex problems to frustrated employees who made mistakes. 3 months ago, on a rainy Thursday evening in October, Isabella had been coloring a Halloween picture in the reception area while her mother cleaned Mr. Henderson's corner office. The building was supposed to be empty, except for security guards and cleaning crews. So when Isabella heard voices coming from the executive conference room, her natural curiosity was piqued. Through the partially open door, she could see Mrs. Henderson, the pretty blonde woman who sometimes visited and always wore expensive perfume, talking intensely with another woman Isabella didn't recognize. The stranger was older, maybe 50, with short red hair and the kind of stern expression Isabella's teacher wore when someone was in serious trouble. "The timeline is absolutely critical, Sandra," Mrs. Henderson was saying, her voice cold and calculating in a way that made Isabella's stomach feel funny. "The transfers need to happen before the annual audit begins. Once Robert's signature is on those authorization documents, there'll be no way for anyone to trace the money back to us." Isabella froze. Her crayons scattered across her coloring book. She didn't understand all the big words, but she knew enough about adult conversations to recognize that something very wrong was being discussed. Instinctively, she reached into her pink backpack and pulled out the small digital recorder her second-grade teacher had given her for a project about family oral histories. Her tiny fingers found the red record button just as Mrs. Henderson continued, $689 million, Sandra. It's more money than we ever dreamed possible. After 23 years of marriage to that self-righteous fool, watching him get credit for ideas that were partly mine, seeing him treated like some kind of technological genius while I was dismissed as just another trophy wife, I deserve every penny of what we're taking." The red-haired woman's voice was equally cold. "The forensic evidence will be perfect. Every digital signature, every bank transfer, every encrypted file will point directly to Robert. My brother Marcus has created an absolutely bulletproof legal framework. When the FBI gets our anonymous tip, they'll find evidence so overwhelming that even the best defense attorney in America won't be able to create reasonable doubt." Isabella's heart was pounding so hard she was afraid they might hear it. She didn't fully understand what they were planning, but she knew they were going to hurt Mr. Henderson, the kind man who always smiled at her and spoke Spanish with her mother. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with the two women discussing bank account numbers, forged documents, and even a specific timeline for when federal agents would receive their carefully crafted evidence. When her mother called for her from down the hall, Isabella quickly stopped the recording and stuffed the device deep into her backpack. For 3 months, she'd carried this terrible secret, unsure who to trust with information that seemed too big and dangerous for a 7-year-old to handle. But now, watching Mr. Henderson in handcuffs while Mrs. Henderson played the role of grieving victim, Isabella finally understood exactly what she needed to do. The trial's second week brought a parade of prosecution witnesses whose testimony painted Robert Henderson as a master manipulator who'd spent years perfecting his criminal scheme. The courtroom was packed daily with victims seeking justice, reporters documenting every moment of the spectacular downfall, and curious spectators drawn to what media had dubbed the trial of the century. Victoria Henderson took the witness stand on Tuesday morning, looking every inch the wounded ex-wife in a conservative black Armani suit that whispered understated elegance. Her platinum hair was pulled back in a dignified chignon, and she wore minimal makeup that couldn't quite hide the dark circles under her eyes, the supposed result of sleepless nights spent wondering how she'd missed the signs of her ex-husband's criminal behavior. Mrs. Henderson, District Attorney Sarah Chen began gently, "Please tell the jury about changes you observed in your ex-husband's behavior during the final years of your marriage." Victoria's voice was steady, but tinged with unmistakable pain. Robert became increasingly secretive and paranoid. He installed multiple locks on his home office door and began working at strange hours. Sometimes I'd find him at his computer at 3 in the morning, frantically typing and then closing windows whenever I entered the room. When I asked about our financial situation, he became angry and defensive, accusing me of not trusting him or not understanding the complexities of his business. She dabbed her eyes with tissues as she described finding suspicious documents in their home safe, discovering encrypted external hard drives hidden in their bedroom, and overhearing phone conversations where Robert discussed moving assets to safer locations and protecting investments from government interference. "Did your ex-husband ever express resentment toward his investors?" Chen asked. Victoria's answer was devastating. He often complained that investors were naive sheep who deserved whatever happened to their money if they weren't smart enough to protect it themselves. He said the American financial system was designed to reward the clever and punish the stupid, and that he was simply playing by rules that everyone else was too ethical or too cowardly to follow. The jury's faces showed disgust and anger. Several elderly jurors who probably had retirement investments looked personally offended by Robert's alleged attitude toward people like themselves. During cross-examination, Robert's attorney David Murphy attempted desperately to poke holes in Victoria's testimony, but she was prepared for everything. Her story never wavered. Her timeline was consistent with all documented evidence, and she had photographs, emails, and witness statements to support every major claim. "Mrs. Henderson," Murphy pressed, "isn't it true that you had complete access to your husband's computers, bank accounts, and business files during your marriage? Couldn't you have created this evidence yourself?" Victoria looked genuinely hurt by the suggestion. "Mr. Murphy, I loved Robert deeply. Even after our painful divorce, I hoped we could maintain a civilized relationship for our daughter's sake. The idea that I would frame him for crimes he didn't commit isn't just legally absurd, it's emotionally devastating. I'm testifying against him because I believe in justice, and because I owe it to all the families he's destroyed to tell the truth about what I witnessed." Her performance was flawless, convincing even some of Robert's remaining supporters that he was guilty of the charges. In the gallery, former Henderson Tech employees nodded grimly, remembering incidents that now seemed like obvious warning signs of criminal behavior. Meanwhile, 7-year-old Isabella Martinez sat in the courtroom's back row during lunch recess with her mother, watching the proceedings with growing urgency. The small digital recorder remained hidden in her pink unicorn backpack, its contents representing the only evidence that could expose Victoria's lies and save Mr. Henderson from spending the rest of his life in prison. But Isabella was terrified of the powerful adults around her, unsure if a cleaning lady's daughter would be believed over a wealthy woman whose testimony was destroying an innocent man's life. As the prosecution's case built toward its devastating climax, Robert Henderson appeared to be a completely broken man. The weight of false accusations, public humiliation, and his daughter's rejection had transformed him from a confident business leader into a hollow shell of his former self. He'd lost over 40 pounds during his 3 months in jail. His expensive suits now hung loose on his diminished frame, and prison had aged him what seemed like decades. The psychological toll was even worse than the physical deterioration. Emily, his 19-year-old daughter studying economics at Columbia University, had not only refused to visit him, but had publicly changed her last name to her mother's maiden name, Crawford. The girl he'd raised since she was 3 years old, whom he'd taught to ride bicycles in Central Park and supported through every childhood crisis, now gave interviews to financial magazines describing her relief at discovering her father's true nature before she became complicit in his criminal empire. "I always wondered how we could afford such an extravagant lifestyle on a tech executive's salary," Emily had told Forbes magazine. "Now I understand that everything I grew up with, our house, my private school education, our family vacations, was all purchased with stolen money. I feel like my entire childhood was built on lies, and I need to distance myself from that legacy to build my own honest future." The prosecution's star witness was Dr. Sandra Mitchell, a forensic accountant whose testimony was methodical, comprehensive, and utterly damning. With 30 years of experience investigating complex financial crimes for the FBI, she had traced every dollar of the allegedly stolen money through an intricate web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and fake business transactions that spanned 7 countries and involved dozens of financial institutions. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Dr. Mitchell explained, using detailed charts and computer presentations to illustrate the money trail, "this embezzlement scheme represents the most sophisticated financial fraud I have encountered in my entire career. Mr. Henderson clearly spent months, possibly years, planning every aspect of this operation. The level of technical expertise required to create false documentation, establish overseas banking relationships, and manipulate corporate accounting systems demonstrates extensive preparation and intimate knowledge of international financial networks." What the courtroom didn't know, what even Robert's defense attorney hadn't discovered, was that Dr. Sandra Mitchell was Victoria Henderson's sister-in-law, married to Victoria's brother, Marcus Goldstein, the same Marcus who now served as Victoria's attorney in the divorce proceedings. Through careful legal maneuvering and name changes following her marriage, Sandra had hidden this family connection from all background checks and conflict of interest investigations. The conspiracy wasn't just about money, it was about revenge. Victoria had spent 23 years watching Robert receive credit for technological innovations that she believed were partially her ideas, seeing him celebrated as a visionary while she was dismissed as decorative arm candy at corporate events. She'd contributed research, provided networking connections through her family's political contacts, and offered strategic advice that had helped build Henderson Tech into a global empire. But Robert's name was on the patents. Robert received the industry awards, and Robert was worth nearly $1 billion, while her divorce settlement, though substantial, left her feeling cheated and resentful. During an afternoon recess, Isabella overheard her mother talking quietly in Spanish with another janitor from the building. "El pobre hombre se ve tan triste. I remember when he used to work late, always kind to us, never treating us like we were invisible. Es difícil creer que he could do such terrible things to families with children." Isabella's heart ached as she watched Mr. Henderson sitting alone at the defendant's table, abandoned by everyone who had once claimed to care about him. She thought about the recorder in her backpack, about the terrible conversation she'd witnessed, about the kind man who was going to prison for crimes he never committed. That evening, as they waited for the bus home after Maria had finished her cleaning shift, Isabella made a decision that would change the course of everything. "Mami," she said in urgent Spanish, pulling on her mother's sleeve, "tengo que decirte something very important about Mr. Henderson, something I heard Mrs. Henderson say when she thought Nady was listening." The next morning brought unprecedented chaos to the Manhattan courthouse as Maria Martinez, trembling with nervousness but determined to seek justice, approached the imposing building where her daughter's testimony could save an innocent man's life. She had spent the entire night listening to Isabella's recording, her limited English supplemented by her daughter's translation of the complex conversation they'd captured. The audio was crystal clear, Victoria Henderson's voice unmistakably cold and calculating as she detailed her conspiracy with the mysterious Sandra. Every word of their plan was documented, the precise amount they intended to steal, the timeline for framing Robert, even the specific methods they would use to plant evidence and manipulate forensic investigations. But Maria faced an seemingly impossible challenge. As an undocumented immigrant from El Salvador who spoke limited English and worked as a nighttime cleaning lady, she was trying to take on one of Manhattan's most powerful and wealthy families. Victoria Henderson had unlimited resources, the best attorneys money could buy, and social connections that reached into the highest levels of New York's legal and political establishment. With Isabella's small hand gripping hers tightly, Maria climbed the courthouse steps, where dozens of reporters gathered each morning for their daily briefings about the trial. Her broken English and thick accent made communication difficult, but her desperation was unmistakable as she approached the crowd of journalists. "Por favor, please," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I have something more important about Mr. Henderson case. My daughter, she hear everything. Mrs. Henderson, she make the plan to steal the money and blame Mr. Henderson. We have recording, we have proof he is innocent man." Most reporters initially dismissed her as another conspiracy theorist or attention seeker. Every high-profile trial attracted dozens of people claiming to have secret evidence or inside information. But veteran journalist Patricia Walsh from the New York Herald, who had covered financial crimes for over 20 years, recognized something different in Maria's urgency and Isabella's solemn, frightened expression. When Isabella shyly produced the small digital recorder from her pink unicorn backpack, Patricia's investigative instincts immediately kicked into high gear. She'd developed an eye for authentic evidence during her decades of investigative reporting, and something about the little girl's obvious terror and the mother's desperate sincerity suggested this wasn't a hoax or publicity stunt. Patricia took Maria and Isabella to a quiet corner of the courthouse lobby and listened to the first minute of the recording through earphones. Her blood ran cold as she heard Victoria Henderson's voice, clearly discussing financial fraud, timeline coordination, and plans to frame Robert for crimes he hadn't committed. "Jesus Christ," Patricia whispered, immediately calling her editor while simultaneously running the audio through her phone's voice analysis software. Within 2 hours, she had verified the voices through digital comparison with Victoria's previous media interviews and confirmed the timeline of the conversation with Henderson Tech building security records showing when Victoria had visited the offices. The recording was authentic, devastating, and about to completely destroy the prosecution's case while exposing a conspiracy that reached far beyond simple embezzlement. But first, Patricia knew she needed to ensure Isabella's safety. People willing to steal hundreds of millions of dollars and frame an innocent man wouldn't hesitate to intimidate or harm a vulnerable child and her mother. Inside the courthouse, Robert's attorney, David Murphy, was preparing what he expected to be his final, desperate closing argument when his phone buzzed with an urgent text from Patricia Walsh. "Stop everything immediately. I have evidence that will completely exonerate your client. 7-year-old witness with digital recording of Victoria Henderson confessing to framing Robert. Can you request emergency hearing with Judge Williams? Murphy's hands shook as he read the message again to make sure he wasn't hallucinating. In 28 years of legal practice, defending everyone from white-collar criminals to organized crime figures, he had never experienced such a dramatic reversal of fortune. As word spread through the courthouse that explosive new evidence was about to be presented, Victoria Henderson felt the first cold fingers of panic creeping up her spine, though her expression remained perfectly composed. Her carefully constructed plan was about to be destroyed by the one person she had never considered a threat, a 7-year-old girl who had been invisible in her world of power and privilege, but who had been listening to everything. Judge Patricia Williams had presided over Manhattan's Superior Court for 18 years, but nothing had prepared her for the emergency hearing that was about to unfold. At 3:47 p.m., on what should have been a routine Wednesday afternoon, she found herself facing the most extraordinary reversal in legal history. The mahogany-paneled courtroom, usually reserved for final arguments and jury deliberations, was now packed with reporters, attorneys, and court officials who had rushed in after hearing rumors of explosive new evidence. "Your Honor," David Murphy said, his voice trembling with barely contained excitement, "I have just been presented with audio evidence that completely exonerates my client and exposes a conspiracy that goes to the very heart of this case. I'm requesting an immediate hearing to present this evidence and a 7-year-old witness whose testimony will fundamentally change everything this court believes about Robert Henderson's innocence." District Attorney Sarah Chen shot to her feet, her face flushed with anger and confusion. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The defense has had months to present evidence, and we're in the middle of closing arguments. This appears to be a desperate attempt to create reasonable doubt through last-minute theatrics." But Judge Williams had noticed something in Murphy's expression that suggested this wasn't a legal stunt. In her years on the bench, she'd developed an instinct for distinguishing between genuine breakthrough moments and attorney desperation. "I'll allow a brief presentation of this evidence, but Mr. Murphy, it better be substantial enough to justify disrupting these proceedings." Isabella Martinez entered the courtroom, holding her mother's hand, looking impossibly small in the massive legal arena where her words were about to destroy a multi-million-dollar conspiracy. She wore her best dress, a simple blue outfit with white flowers that her mother had bought for her first communion, and her long dark hair was braided with pink ribbons that matched her beloved unicorn backpack. Victoria Henderson's perfectly composed mask slipped for the first time in months when she saw Isabella walking toward the witness stand. Her sharp intake of breath was audible to everyone in the front row, and her hands involuntarily clenched into fists before she forced them to relax. Marcus Goldstein, her attorney, leaned over to whisper urgent questions, but Victoria's attention was completely focused on the little girl who somehow possessed the power to destroy her. "Your Honor," Murphy continued, "this child overheard a conversation between Victoria Henderson and her co-conspirator 3 months before my client's arrest. She recorded that conversation on a device given to her for a school project. What you're about to hear will prove that Robert Henderson is the victim of an elaborate frame-up orchestrated by his ex-wife and her family." As Isabella was sworn in with special accommodations for her age, her large brown eyes surveyed the courtroom with remarkable composure. She had spent the previous evening with her mother and journalist Patricia Walsh, preparing for this moment while never losing sight of why she needed to speak up. Mr. Henderson was a kind man who didn't deserve to go to prison for something he didn't do. "Isabella," Murphy said gently, kneeling down to her level, "can you tell us about the night you heard Mrs. Henderson talking in the office building?" Isabella's voice was clear and steady. "It was Thursday night, October 15th. Mommy was cleaning Mr. Henderson's office, and I was coloring in the reception area. I heard voices from the conference room, Mrs. Henderson and another lady with red hair. They were talking about taking money and making it look like Mr. Henderson did it. The courtroom was absolutely silent as Isabella continued her testimony, describing in remarkable detail the conversation she'd witnessed. Despite her young age, her memory was precise. She recalled specific phrases, the emotional tone of the discussion, even the time of night when it occurred. When Murphy played the audio recording, Victoria Henderson's voice filled the courtroom with chilling clarity. $689 million, Sandra. After 23 years of marriage to that self-righteous fool, I deserve every penny of what we're taking. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Gasps echoed throughout the gallery. Several jurors covered their mouths in shock, and reporters frantically scribbled notes as they witnessed one of the most dramatic courtroom reversals in legal history. Victoria Henderson's world was collapsing in real time, but her survival instincts kicked in with desperate fury. The aftermath of Isabella's testimony created pandemonium that Judge Williams struggled to control, even with repeated strikes of her gavel. Reporters shouted questions, spectators voiced their outrage, and court officers worked frantically to maintain order in what had become a media circus of unprecedented proportions. Victoria Henderson rose from her seat with the calculated grace of a woman who had spent her entire adult life manipulating situations to her advantage. Despite the devastating audio evidence, she wasn't prepared to surrender without deploying every weapon in her considerable arsenal. "Your Honor!" she called out, her voice cutting through the chaos with surprising authority. "I request permission to address these outrageous allegations immediately. This is clearly a coordinated attack on my character using a confused child who has been coached to recite a fabricated story." Marcus Goldstein, her attorney, frantically tried to restrain his client, recognizing that any spontaneous statement could only make her legal situation worse. But Victoria had moved beyond legal strategy into pure survival mode, and she was determined to fight for her freedom with the same ruthless intelligence that had created the conspiracy in the first place. Judge Williams, recognizing the extraordinary nature of the situation, made the unusual decision to allow Victoria to respond. "Mrs. Henderson, you may make a brief statement, but I must warn you that anything you say can and will be used against you in subsequent legal proceedings." Victoria's response was masterful in its desperation. She painted herself as the victim of an elaborate setup orchestrated by Robert's supporters, suggesting that the recording was either fabricated using advanced audio technology or represented a conversation taken completely out of context. Her voice carried just the right tone of wounded innocence mixed with righteous indignation. "That little girl has been manipulated by people who want to see my ex-husband escape justice," Victoria declared, pointing directly at Isabella. "She's been coached to tell a story that supposedly exonerates a man who has already confessed to financial irregularities in his business dealings. This is nothing more than a desperate attempt to create reasonable doubt using a child who doesn't understand the complexity of adult business conversations." But Isabella's courage in that moment proved more powerful than Victoria's decades of manipulation experience. The 7-year-old looked directly at Victoria and said in her clear, innocent voice, "I know what I heard, Mrs. Henderson. You said Mr. Henderson was a fool, and you wanted to take his money. You said it was more money than you ever dreamed of, and you deserved it after being married to him for 23 years. The precision of Isabella's recollection, delivered without coaching or hesitation, was devastating to Victoria's credibility. Several jurors were visibly moved by the contrast between the child's obvious honesty and Victoria's increasingly desperate denials. District Attorney Chen, recognizing that her case had been completely undermined, requested an immediate recess to consult with her superiors about the unprecedented situation. The prosecution team huddled in urgent conference, reviewing the audio evidence and discussing the legal implications of continuing their case against Robert when their star witness had been exposed as the actual criminal. Meanwhile, Forensic audio specialists were already analyzing the recording, confirming its authenticity through digital analysis that would later prove the conversation was genuine and unaltered. Voice pattern recognition software matched Victoria's speech patterns perfectly with her previous recorded statements, while background noise analysis confirmed the conversation had taken place in the Henderson Tech building during the time period Isabella specified. Robert Henderson, who had spent months believing his life was effectively over, sat in stunned silence as he watched his ex-wife's elaborate deception crumble before his eyes. For the first time since his arrest, he allowed himself to hope that he might actually survive this nightmare and reclaim his reputation, his freedom, and possibly even his relationship with his daughter. But the most dramatic revelations were yet to come, as investigators were already beginning to uncover the full scope of Victoria's conspiracy and the powerful family connections that had made it possible. The courtroom atmosphere had transformed from a criminal trial into something resembling a congressional hearing as federal investigators flooded the building to begin unraveling what was clearly a massive conspiracy involving multiple family members and professional accomplices. FBI Financial Crimes Division agents worked with court officials to secure all evidence, while additional charges were being prepared against Victoria and her co-conspirators. Dr. Sandra Mitchell, the forensic accountant whose testimony had been so damaging to Robert's case, was escorted from the courthouse in handcuffs as investigators revealed her true identity as Victoria's sister-in-law. The supposed independent expert witness was actually Sandra Goldstein Mitchell, married to Marcus Goldstein's brother David, making her part of the extended family conspiracy that had stolen hundreds of millions of dollars while framing an innocent man. The investigation moved with unprecedented speed as authorities traced the real money trail. Within hours, forensic accountants working for the government had discovered the actual offshore accounts where the stolen funds were hidden, accounts registered not to Robert Henderson, but to a complex network of shell companies controlled by Victoria and her family members. The sophistication of this frame-up operation is unlike anything we've seen in federal law enforcement, FBI Special Agent Patricia Morrison told reporters during an impromptu press conference on the courthouse steps. The conspiracy involved forged digital signatures, planted computer evidence, fabricated bank records, and the corruption of what should have been an independent forensic investigation. If not for the courage of a 7-year-old witness, an innocent man would have spent the rest of his life in prison for crimes he never committed. Inside the courthouse, Robert Henderson was finally released from custody amid scenes of jubilation from supporters who had never stopped believing in his innocence. His first request was to meet privately with Isabella Martinez and her mother, the two people who had saved his life and reputation when everyone else had abandoned him. The meeting took place in Judge Williams' chambers, away from the media circus that had engulfed the courthouse. Robert knelt down to Isabella's level, tears streaming down his face as he struggled to find words adequate to express his gratitude. "Isabella," he said in careful Spanish, "you are the bravest little girl I have ever met. You didn't have to help me, but you chose to do the right thing, even when it was scary. You saved my life, and I will never, ever forget what you did." Isabella smiled shyly and responded in English. "You were always nice to me and Mommy, Mr. Henderson. I knew you wouldn't steal money from families. That's why I kept the recording safe in my backpack." Maria Martinez, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had transpired, accepted Robert's promise to ensure her family's financial security and immigration status. "We don't want money, Mr. Henderson," she said in her careful English. "We just wanted to do what was right. But if you could help Isabella go to a good school someday, that would be wonderful." Meanwhile, Victoria Henderson's arrest was being coordinated by multiple law enforcement agencies as the scope of her crimes expanded beyond simple fraud to include conspiracy, racketeering, witness tampering, and money laundering across international borders. Her family's political connections, which had initially seemed like protection, were now becoming liabilities as federal prosecutors built cases against everyone involved in the conspiracy. The media coverage was unprecedented, with every major news network broadcasting continuous updates about what commentators were calling the most spectacular legal reversal in American history. Financial markets reacted positively to news that Henderson Tech had been cleared of criminal wrongdoing, with the company's stock price recovering much of its lost value as investors realized the firm's fundamental business operations remained sound. But the most important moment came when Emily Henderson, Robert's daughter, called her father for the first time since his arrest. Through tears and apologies, she begged his forgiveness for doubting him and asked if she could visit him immediately to begin rebuilding their relationship. The nightmare was finally over, but the complete story of Victoria's revenge plot was still being uncovered by investigators who were amazed by the depth and complexity of her criminal enterprise. 3 days after the dramatic courtroom reversal, federal investigators had uncovered a conspiracy that reached far beyond a simple case of financial fraud. The Henderson case had exposed a sophisticated criminal organization that had operated for years, using family connections, professional corruption, and elaborate deception to steal hundreds of millions of dollars while destroying innocent lives. Victoria Henderson's arrest at her Hamptons estate was captured by news helicopters as FBI agents executed search warrants on multiple properties across New York and Connecticut. Hidden in her home office safe, investigators discovered detailed planning documents that revealed the true scope of her revenge plot against Robert. The conspiracy had been years in the making, beginning even before their divorce was finalized. Victoria's resentment had grown from feeling undervalued during their marriage into a burning desire for revenge that consumed her completely. She had meticulously documented Robert's business activities, personal habits, and psychological vulnerabilities, looking for the perfect opportunity to destroy him while enriching herself. The breakthrough came when she reconnected with her brother Marcus Goldstein, a lawyer who had always harbored his own resentments against successful businessmen like Robert. Together, they had recruited Sandra Mitchell, whose forensic accounting credentials provided the perfect cover for manipulating financial evidence. David Goldstein, Marcus's brother and Sandra's husband, had used his position as a software engineer to create the fake digital signatures and computer evidence that had seemed so convincing to investigators. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation was the discovery of Victoria's detailed psychological profile of Robert, written with clinical precision that revealed her intimate knowledge of how to inflict maximum emotional damage. She had deliberately targeted not just his money and freedom, but his relationships with his daughter, his business partners, and his place in the community he had served for decades. She wanted to destroy him completely, FBI psychologist Dr. Rebecca Torres explained to investigators. This wasn't just about money, it was about revenge so total that Robert Henderson would lose everything that gave his life meaning. The financial theft was almost secondary to her desire to see him suffer. Meanwhile, Isabella Martinez had become an overnight sensation, with news organizations around the world telling the story of the brave little girl whose honesty had exposed a massive conspiracy. Her school organized a special assembly to honor her courage, and she received thousands of letters from people thanking her for proving that truth and justice could still prevail over wealth and corruption. Robert Henderson, now completely exonerated and working to rebuild his business empire, established the Isabella Martinez Foundation for Children's Education, ensuring that the little girl who had saved his life would have every opportunity to pursue her dreams. The foundation also provided scholarships for children of immigrant families, honoring the community that had produced such remarkable courage. The legal proceedings moved swiftly as Victoria and her co-conspirators faced overwhelming evidence of their crimes. With the original recording, financial records seized from multiple locations, and testimony from investigators who had traced the money trail, prosecutors built an airtight case that left little room for plea bargaining. Victoria's attempts to maintain her innocence became increasingly desperate as each day brought new evidence of her guilt. Her expensive legal team, led by attorneys who specialized in defending wealthy criminals, struggled to create any viable defense strategy when faced with their client's own recorded confession and a mountain of corroborating evidence. But the most dramatic moment came when Emily Henderson visited her father in his restored penthouse apartment, bringing with her a letter she had written but never sent, a letter apologizing for doubting him and expressing her love despite the terrible circumstances that had separated them. "Dad," she said through tears, "I was so angry and confused that I let other people convince me you were someone I knew you could never be. Can you ever forgive me for abandoning you when you needed me most?" Robert's response was immediate and heartfelt. "Emily, you are my daughter, and I love you unconditionally. We both learned something important about the power of lies and the importance of family loyalty. What matters now is that we're together again." The reconciliation between father and daughter, provided a touching counterpoint to the ongoing legal drama, reminding everyone following the case that the real victims of Victoria's crimes were the families she had torn apart in pursuit of her twisted revenge. 6 weeks after Isabella's testimony had shattered Victoria Henderson's conspiracy, the final pieces of the criminal puzzle were falling into place as federal prosecutors prepared for what promised to be one of the most closely watched trials in recent American history. The case had expanded beyond financial fraud to encompass charges of racketeering, international money laundering, conspiracy to commit perjury, and witness tampering across multiple jurisdictions. Victoria's downfall was accelerating as investigators uncovered evidence of additional crimes dating back over a decade. Bank records revealed that she had been systematically stealing from Robert's business accounts throughout their marriage, using her access as his wife to siphon funds that she had then invested in her own name. The divorce settlement that had seemed generous at the time was actually paid for with Robert's own stolen money, adding another layer of cruel irony to her betrayal. The international scope of her crimes became clear as authorities in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, and Panama cooperated with American investigators to trace the stolen funds through a labyrinthine network of shell companies and fake business entities. Victoria had created an entire parallel financial empire, complete with forged documents, bribed bank officials, and corrupted legal representatives who had helped her move hundreds of millions of dollars without detection. Marcus Goldstein, facing his own federal charges, had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing devastating testimony about his sister's psychological state and criminal planning. Victoria was consumed by hatred for Robert, he told investigators. She felt that he had stolen credit for ideas that were partially hers, that he had minimized her contributions to building his empire, and that he deserved to suffer for what she saw as years of condescension and dismissal. The most shocking revelation came when investigators discovered that Victoria had been planning to flee the country immediately after Robert's conviction, using false identity documents to establish a new life in a non-extradition country where she could enjoy her stolen wealth without fear of prosecution. Her escape plan included detailed psychological profiles of her daughter Emily, suggesting she might have attempted to manipulate her into joining her in exile. Dr. Sandra Mitchell, the corrupt forensic accountant, had already pleaded guilty to multiple federal charges and was cooperating fully with investigators to avoid spending the rest of her life in prison. Her testimony revealed that the conspiracy had involved bribing court officials, manipulating evidence storage procedures, and even conducting surveillance on Robert's defense team to stay ahead of their investigation strategies. But perhaps the most heartening development was watching Isabella Martinez adjust to her sudden fame with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout the crisis. Now 8 years old and enrolled in one of Manhattan's most prestigious private schools, thanks to Robert Henderson's generosity, she continued to demonstrate the remarkable character that had given her the courage to speak truth to power when it mattered most. Isabella understands that she did something very important, her mother Maria explained to reporters. But she also knows that she was just doing what her conscience told her was right. We taught her that good people help each other, especially when someone is being treated unfairly. Robert Henderson had not only recovered financially from the false accusations, but had seen his business empire grow larger than ever, as investors flocked to support a man whose integrity had been so dramatically vindicated. Henderson Tech's stock had reached record highs, and Robert had used his restored wealth to establish multiple charitable foundations focused on supporting immigrant families and protecting children from adult manipulation. The relationship between Robert and Emily had grown stronger than it had ever been before the crisis. Their shared experience of betrayal and reconciliation had created a bond that transcended their previous father-daughter relationship, making them genuine friends who understood each other's vulnerabilities and strengths. As Victoria's trial date approached, legal experts predicted that she would face decades in federal prison for crimes that had shocked even experienced prosecutors with their callousness and sophistication. Her attempts to portray herself as a victim of Robert's success had been completely discredited by the overwhelming evidence of her calculated criminal behavior. But the most important outcome of the entire ordeal was the validation of a simple truth, that honesty and courage, even from the most unlikely sources, could still triumph over wealth, corruption, and elaborate deception in American society. 1 year after Isabella Martinez's courageous testimony had exposed the conspiracy that nearly destroyed an innocent man's life, the final chapter of the Henderson case was being written in the same Manhattan courthouse where the drama had originally unfolded. Victoria Henderson stood before Judge Patricia Williams for sentencing, having been convicted on all 17 federal charges related to her elaborate fraud scheme. The courtroom was packed with many of the same faces who had witnessed Isabella's testimony 12 months earlier, but the atmosphere was completely different. Where there had once been uncertainty and confusion, there was now a sense of justice finally being served. Victoria, now 49, looked dramatically older than her years, her platinum hair showing grey roots and her expensive wardrobe replaced by standard prison clothing. Mrs. Henderson, Judge Williams said, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority earned through decades of presiding over complex cases. In 32 years on the bench, I've never encountered a case that so clearly demonstrated the depths of human greed and the lengths to which someone will go to destroy an innocent person out of pure malice. Your crimes were not motivated by desperation or necessity, but by a calculated desire for revenge that consumed your judgment and your conscience. The evidence presented during Victoria's trial had revealed the full scope of her criminal empire. Prosecutors had traced stolen funds totaling over $900 million when interest and hidden investments were included. Her conspiracy had involved corrupting dozens of professionals, bribing government officials in 3 countries, and manipulating the American legal system in ways that threatened the foundation of justice itself. Isabella Martinez, now 8 years old and thriving in her new school, had been invited to witness the sentencing as a symbol of how individual courage could triumph over systemic corruption. She sat quietly in the front row next to her mother and Robert Henderson, wearing the same blue dress with white flowers that she had worn for her testimony, her pink unicorn backpack at her feet containing her school homework rather than world-changing evidence. The defendant will serve 35 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, Judge Williams announced. Additionally, all assets obtained through criminal activity will be forfeited to compensate victims of this massive fraud. The court hopes that this sentence sends a clear message that wealth and social connections cannot protect someone from the consequences of deliberate criminal behavior. Victoria's reaction was a mixture of rage and disbelief. Even faced with overwhelming evidence and multiple witness testimonies, she had maintained her innocence throughout the trial, apparently unable to accept that her perfect plan had been destroyed by a 7-year-old child she had never bothered to notice. Robert Henderson, now 63 and looking healthier and more confident than he had in years, had used his restored freedom and wealth to create positive change that honored the courage of the family who had saved him. The Isabella Martinez Foundation had already provided scholarships to over 500 immigrant children, while his expanded business empire had created thousands of new jobs in underserved communities. Emily Henderson, now 20 and studying business administration, had become her father's closest advisor and heir apparent, their relationship strengthened by the shared experience of surviving Victoria's betrayal. She had legally changed her name back to Henderson and publicly credited her father with teaching her the importance of integrity in both personal and professional relationships. "What happened to our family was terrible," Emily told reporters outside the courthouse, "but it also showed us what really matters: truth, loyalty, and the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult. Isabella Martinez is my hero, because she proved that one person's honesty can overcome any amount of deception." The most touching moment of the sentencing hearing came when Isabella was invited to make a brief statement to the court. In her clear, innocent voice, she said, "I hope Mrs. Henderson learns that hurting people doesn't make you feel better, and I hope Mr. Henderson knows that good people always have friends who will help them." As the court session ended and Victoria was led away to begin her decades-long prison sentence, Isabella skipped out of the courthouse holding hands with her mother and Robert, chatting excitedly about her upcoming piano recital and a science project about butterflies. Her life had returned to normal childhood concerns, but her courage had changed the lives of everyone around her. The Henderson case became a landmark in American legal history, studied in law schools and business ethics courses, as an example of how individual moral courage could overcome even the most sophisticated criminal conspiracy. But for Isabella Martinez, it was simply the story of how she had helped a kind man who had always been nice to her and her mother. Justice had been served, families had been reunited, and a little girl's honesty had proved more powerful than millions of dollars and elaborate deception. In a world often dominated by cynicism about wealth and power, the Henderson case had restored faith in the fundamental American belief that truth and courage would ultimately prevail over corruption and lies. The nightmare was finally over, replaced by a future built on the foundation of trust, integrity, and the unshakable bond between people who had stood together when it mattered most.